I found it while I was trying to shove my empty suitcases under the bed frame. The floorboard felt loose, just a fraction of an inch off, and when I pried it up, I didn't find money or jewelry. It was just a dusty external hard drive with a piece of masking tape on it that said "Do not delete" in shaky, black Sharpie. I plugged it into my laptop, expecting some old college photos or maybe a pirated movie collection. The first file was a video dated exactly 2 years ago. It showed a guy, maybe a few years older than me, holding a phone camera and grinning. He was talking about how he had finally found a place in the city that didn't cost 3 months' rent just for a security deposit. He looked so relieved, so happy. But as he panned the camera to show off the walk-in closet, I saw it. In the dark gap of the doorway, a figure was standing perfectly still. It was Mr. Steele. He wasn't moving, wasn't saying a word, just watching the back of the guy's head with an expression that looked like he was staring at a piece of meat.
To understand how Jonathan ended up in that room, you have to understand the desperation of a grad student with $600 to his name and a week before classes start. Craigslist is usually a nightmare of scams and bait-and-switch listings, but Mr. Steele's ad had been a godsend. It was a beautiful, albeit slightly dated, craftsman-style house only 2 miles from campus. Mr. Steele was a soft-spoken retiree who wore knitted vests and spent most of his time tending to a small garden in the backyard. The rent was impossibly low, and the only catch was a verbal agreement. Mr. Steele had explained that the basement was off-limits because of structural issues and mold that he couldn't afford to fix yet. At the time, Jonathan didn't care. He had a roof over his head and a landlord who didn't seem to mind that he stayed up late studying.
The first week was fine, or at least I told myself it was. But then the smell started. It wasn't the smell of mold or old wood. It was the sharp, clinical sting of chlorine drifting through the vents every night around 2 a.m. It made my eyes water if I sat too close to the register. Then there were the conversations. I would be on the phone with my sister, talking about my car's transmission or a specific professor I disliked. And the next morning at breakfast, Mr. Steele would bring up those exact topics. He would say something like, "It is a shame about those old Fords. They really don't build them to last." Or, "You shouldn't let grumpy teachers get under your skin." Jonathan. I knew the walls weren't that thin. I had checked. They were solid lath and plaster, at least 5 inches thick.
The curiosity became a physical weight in Jonathan's chest. On a Tuesday morning, he watched from the upstairs window as Mr. Steele loaded his garden tools into his old truck and drove away for his weekly trip to the hardware store in town. Jonathan knew he had about 45 minutes. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy flathead screwdriver, and headed for the basement door. The lock was a simple deadbolt, and it took less than a minute to pop the cylinder. He expected to find a dark, damp cellar filled with boxes of junk. Instead, the stairs led down to a room that was eerily clean. There were no cobwebs, no mold, and no structural issues. Against the far wall stood a professional-grade steel shelving unit. Neatly lined up on the middle shelf were 12 identical external hard drives. Each one had a label with a name and a date range spanning exactly 90 days.
I grabbed the first drive, labeled Marcus, full, and ran back upstairs to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I plugged it in and opened the root folder. It was a nightmare of organization. There were subfolders for every room in the house: bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, I clicked on a file from Marcus's second month. The video quality was crystal clear, shot from an angle near the ceiling fan. Marcus was sitting at the same desk where I now sat, but he looked terrible. He was pale, his eyes were sunken, and he couldn't stop coughing. It was a deep, wet sound that seemed to rattle his whole frame. In the final video on the drive, Marcus finally slumped over the desk, completely unconscious. The bedroom door creaked open, and Mr. Steele walked in. He wasn't wearing his gardening clothes anymore. He was wearing blue surgical scrubs and carrying a tray with a single, oversized medical syringe. He didn't look angry. He looked like a professional going to work. I started tabbing through the folders, comparing the timestamps on each drive. A cold realization settled in my gut. Every single person, Marcus, Sarah, David, all of them, had been in this house for exactly 90 days. In this state, the law is very specific. Once a guest hits that 90-day mark, they are legally considered a tenant with full squatting rights, making it a nightmare to evict them. Mr. Steele wasn't just a landlord. He was a clock watcher. He made sure no one ever made it to day 91.
Jonathan opened the folder for resident number 5, a guy named Leo. The footage wasn't just physical surveillance. It documented a calculated psychological execution. Jonathan watched as Mr. Steele used a signal jammer to drop Leo's cell service whenever he tried to call home. He saw footage of Mr. Steele intercepting Leo's mail at the front porch, replacing letters from his family with forged notes typed on an old Underwood. One letter Jonathan read on the screen broke his heart. It told Leo that his parents were ashamed of him and didn't want him coming home for Thanksgiving. Leo spent the rest of that night sobbing on his bed, completely unaware that his father was only 50 miles away, wondering why his son wouldn't pick up the phone.
My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type as I searched for the names on the drives. I found them on missing persons databases and old Reddit threads about cold cases. They were all listed as runaways. According to the police reports, every one of them had sent a final, bridge-burning email to their families right before they vanished, claiming they were hopping a bus to Vegas or Mexico to start over. It was the perfect cover. Mr. Steele didn't just steal their lives. He stole their reputations, making sure no one would come looking for them until the trail was months cold.
Then Jonathan reached the final drive. Number 12. The name on the label was Chloe. The footage showed a girl who had lived in the house only a month before Jonathan moved in. The video was dated just a few weeks ago. Jonathan watched, paralyzed, as Chloe found the loose floorboard, found the drives, and ran down to the basement just like he had. The camera in the basement captured her frantic face as she realized what the archive meant. But as she turned to run back up the stairs, the heavy wooden door at the top opened. Mr. Steele stood there, silhouetted against the kitchen light. He didn't scream. He just stepped down into the dark, and the video cut to black.
I stared at the blank screen, the silence of the house suddenly feeling like a tomb. That was when I heard it. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the front door closing upstairs. My heart stopped. Mr. Steele's truck hadn't been gone for more than 20 minutes. He should have been at the hardware store 3 miles away. Then came the sound of the deadbolt sliding home with a definitive metallic click. He wasn't just home. He was locking me in. I realized then that the Do Not Delete drive wasn't a mistake I had found. It was a test. And I had just failed it. I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the kitchen floor directly toward the basement door. I scrambled across the basement floor, my eyes darting toward the two small windows near the ceiling. They looked like a way out, showing a bright, sunny afternoon. I piled a couple of old crates to reach them, but when my hand touched the glass, it didn't feel like glass at all. It was warm, plastic, and vibrating. I pounded on it, and the sunlight flickered, revealing the grid of a high-definition LED panel. There was no outside. The vents were even worse. Heavy steel grates bolted 6 inches deep into the concrete. I wasn't in a basement. I was in a custom-built vault. I was completely isolated, 10 feet underground, while the world above went on without me.
The basement door creaked open, and Mr. Steele stepped down the stairs. He didn't have a weapon. He was carrying a glass of lemonade and wearing that same pleasant, grandfatherly smile. He sat on the bottom step and looked at Jonathan with genuine pity, like a father watching a child fail a simple math problem.
I am not a murderer, Jonathan. Not in the way the movies portray it. I am a facilitator for progress. Big pharmaceutical companies and chemical plants need human data that the FDA wouldn't allow. You are serving a higher purpose. Most people live and die without contributing anything to science.
He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a 13th drive. It was already labeled with my name. He plugged it into a monitor on the workbench and hit play. I saw myself from a week ago, fast asleep in my bed. The footage showed Mr. Steele standing over me, his face just inches from mine. He was holding a stopwatch and a pulse oximeter, calmly recording my vitals while I dreamed about my future.
You have been a wonderful subject so far. Your respiratory response to the new chlorine compound is much more stable than Chloe's was.
Panic turned into a cold. Sharp survival instinct. Jonathan remembered a clip from drive number 9. A guy named Rick who had tried to rig the gas line. Jonathan didn't need an explosion. He needed a signal. While Mr. Steele was busy explaining the noble nature of his work, Jonathan backed toward the industrial shelving unit. He grabbed a heavy metal canister of test solvent and smashed it against the main electrical breaker box, then jammed a steel rod into the exposed wiring.
The sparks were blinding. I didn't care about the shock that numbed my arm. I just needed the heat. The old insulation ignited instantly, and thick, black smoke began to fill the airtight room. The smoke detectors upstairs started screaming, a sound Mr. Steele couldn't suppress without alerting the neighbors on this quiet suburban street. He lunged at me, his calm facade finally shattering into a mask of pure rage. But the fire was already climbing the walls. Within minutes, I heard the distant, beautiful wail of sirens.
The fire department broke down the front door just as Jonathan was losing consciousness from the fumes. They dragged him out onto the front lawn, and the police found Mr. Steele trying to flush a handful of hard drives down the kitchen sink. The story hit the national news. The Craigslist chemist was all over the headlines. Mr. Steele was headed for life in a maximum security prison, and Jonathan was safe in a hospital bed, surrounded by flowers from his family.
A month later, I was back in a small apartment on the other side of the state, trying to rebuild my life. A package arrived. No return address, just a plain manila envelope. Inside was a single external hard drive with a label that read number 14. My heart stopped as I plugged it in. The video file was dated the day of the fire. It showed me being carried out on a stretcher, then cut to a shot of me in the ICU. 3 days later. asleep. The camera angle was perfect. Shot from a vent directly above my hospital bed. Someone was still watching. Someone was still recording. And they were closer than Mr. Steele ever was.
Thanks for sticking around until the very end. This one definitely makes you think twice about that cheap room for rent on the internet. How would you have reacted if you found those drives in your floor? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this nightmare, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Stay safe out there, and maybe check your vents tonight. Go watch our other videos if you're not planning on sleeping yet. This was an original story written just for this channel. Peace.